Oh, hey guys. So last week we were talking about cattle. I was just listening to some train sounds if you're wondering what that was. Last week we were talking about cattle and the ranchers taking the cows to the railroads. One of the reasons why railroads were in the north is because they started from the East Coast and it was easiest to go straight across the United States, not dip down into the south into Texas. And so these railroads went across the Midwest, went across the middle of the United States, and eventually made it to the West Coast as well. But it took them a while to get down to Texas. And so we're going to show you maps of what that looked like in this intro to railroads. So we're going to talk about why they came to Texas and how it changed Texas for the better. And so this is a rapid expansion of railroads in the late 1800s. So about 1880 is when this expansion of railroads occurs. And so as we're talking about railroads, we're going to be showing you some trains. We're going to be showing you maps of trains, but also listening and seeing what they look like. So we have this little GIF to talk about it, and I'll let you listen to some train sounds for a few seconds. So that is obviously a steam engine train, the first types of trains that we had in Texas. So as we go forward in this video, we're going to talk about trains and how they came into Texas. So here's a map that shows what trains were looking like in 1870. And so these little lines right here, this little one coming into East Texas, McKinney's about this area right here. But this little line right here is showing the expansion of trains into Texas, into East Texas. And then also down here from Galveston Harbor, it came and it branched out a little bit as well. So they kind of look like rivers in this map, but these are railroads. So in 1870, there's very few parts of Texas that are accessible by railroad. And so you guys remember from the cattle maps that we talked about, most of them started down here in the south and then made their way up. Some came out this way through New Mexico. Most of them went up through Oklahoma right here. But very few of them had access to the railroads in this part. And so these railroads only went down to Galveston Bay and then got on ship. And so that's why the ranchers were taking their cattle up into Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska, because there's very few railroads in Texas in 1870. But then we skip ahead 20 years, and this is in 1890. There's railroads all over Texas. This Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex that we live near right here is in that area. The Houston, Austin area down over here. San Antonio get much more involved in railroads as well. And so this is what ended the cattle industry ended the cattle trail industry. They stopped taking their cows from the south part of the United States into the Midwest because they could take them right to the trains near them. And so many of these stops down here, we have the King's Ranch. Up here we had the XIT Ranch. They had train stops that went right to almost the front of these ranches and stopped right there. So instead of having to drive them hundreds and thousands of miles, they only had to drive them across their pastures and across their land right into a train car that could ship them anywhere. And so this is a massive expansion of trains between 1870 and 1890. So I'm going to go back and show you that 1870 map. And then once again, 1890, how quickly it grew. And you can see that where there's like a spiderweb effect of many of them meeting all in one spot is in major cities in Texas. So we have, like I said, Dallas and Fort Worth up here, El Paso over here a few end up, and then we have Houston, Austin, and San Antonio in this area right over here. And so that shows you that many of these major cities built up around the railroads, and the railroads built up around the major cities. So railroads boost industry. Texas railway mileage increased sixfold, meaning 6 times, between 1875 and 1900. So there were 6 times as many railroads in 1900 than there were in 1875 in Texas. This expansion and the sale of the railroad companies of acreage they received from the state and land grants. So very similar to how this Texas government used to give land grants to people to bring them to Texas from the United States. The Texas government was again giving land grants to these companies to build railroads in Texas, so they didn't have to pay for the land, which encouraged them to come to Texas. But it also helped spur the cotton production. Cotton production by Texas farmers increased from 805,000 barrels of cotton in 1880 to over 2.5 million in 1900. So just over 20 years, it doubled and almost tripled in those 20 years of their production. And these are showing cotton bales on a train car. And these are what the train engines looked like at the time period. And this is a railway yard where they would take all their supplies there and then ship them where they needed to go. Mostly cotton went to the north into their factories where they could turn it into cloth and then clothing and other cloth materials. Here is another industry that was impacted by the railroad boost. So it wasn't just cattle, it wasn't just cotton, it was also the lumber industry. So in 1880 again, railroads crisscrossed East Texas where the lumber industry was at its flourish and it was at its highest. So I'll go back to show you that. So right over here, this East Coast or East Texas part right over here is where the lumber industry was very big, and so there's a lot of obviously railways that way, and it flourished as well. So about 200 sawmills employed 1,200 workers, relied on the piney woods for lumber and on the trains to get that wood to market. So they wouldn't just sell the wood right near the piney woods because obviously it's in abundance there. So they would send it elsewhere that didn't have as much wood and make a lot of money. So this is a photo of a teen running errands and push some of the empty railroad cars. So this next industry that was boosted by the railway industry was the meatpacking industry. In 1876, the Texas and Pacific Railway arrived in Fort Worth. By 1886, 4 stockyards were built near the railroad tracks in Fort Worth, contributing to the end of the cattle drives. And so the cattle industry was impacted hugely by the railway industry. Instead of having to drive them hundreds of miles, they now could, just like I said, take them right down the road, put them on the trains, and not have to go very far. It saved a lot of time and a lot of money, and they were still able to make a lot of money by shipping their cattle to the West Coast and the East Coast. So soon after this time period, when all these trains came into Fort Worth became the center of Texas's meatpacking industry, where they would take the cattle there, they would process them, and then send them, like I said, to the East and West Coasts. So what I want you guys to be thinking about as you're listening to this video and going through this week is, how did the development of railroads throughout Texas change Texas? So give you guys a second to think about that. But like I said, that's what question you're going to be trying to answer throughout this week, is how did the development of railroads throughout the state change Texas? So here are some of those answers of how it changed Texas. Products could be shipped to market faster, so you could get things from one place to another much quicker, a lot faster than walking, and a lot faster than taking it by wagon, a lot safer than taking it by ship as well. And so these train cars could take things from one place to another place a lot quicker. So it made it fresh produce, things like that, that needed to get there quicker could arrive in better shape, but also they could push more supplies as well a lot faster. Other products could be shipped into Texas faster as well. And so things that Texas couldn't get from their state, they could get from elsewhere, which helped them a lot. People could travel to and from Texas a lot faster and a lot cheaper. And so that brought more people in, not just to live here, but to vacation, to see the sights, and to learn more about Texas itself. So it made it a lot easier for people to do that, to travel here. And for people who are in Texas to travel elsewhere as well. More immigrants could travel to Texas. This helped open up the whole South once the railroads came this way, because in the whole East Coast, most people came from Europe and then settled in the East Coast and stayed there. And then people that came from Asia settled in the West Coast and stayed there. But when the railroads were able to come to Texas and other southern states, it helped more immigrants move further inward into the United States, into the middle of the country and the south part of the country. And so that helped as well. So railroad stops increased urbanization. And so our next video is going to be about urbanization. We'll talk more about that. But essentially what it means is that more and more people came to the same spot, which led to the growth of major cities. And that's what this GIF is showing you. Urbanization being built all in one place. Like I said, we'll talk about that next video. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video, though, is the population growth between 1850 and 1900. In 1850, the Texas population was 212,592. In 1860, it was 604,215. 1870, it was 818,579. In 1880, it grew very rapidly to 1.5 million, and then 1890, 2.2 million. and it capped out in 1900 at 3,048,710 people. So within just 50 years, Texas's population grew almost 3 million people, and that was directly due to the railroads and bringing more people here and more supplies here and more money here through all those industries we talked about. So the last thing I want to point out before I let you guys go is why this is every 10 years. So there's something that happens in the United States every 10 years, and that's called the census. Every 10 years, our government sends out a document. This year it's online, but it sends out a document that lets you tell how many people live in your in your home, so that way they have an accurate count. And that's why this is done every 10 years. So if your parents haven't done that, make sure you remind them to do so. Have a good rest of your day, guys.